Now, since this is Finland, and you are so famous for your sense of humor, I thought I would begin with a joke. It's not about you, fortunately. For those who remember the Soviet Union, there were actually many people in the Soviet Union who were quite pessimistic about their fate, about their future. And particularly those that lived in the Far East saw or perceived the rise of China. They would even say, we should start learning Chinese. There was actually a joke: there is no disturbance on the China-Finland border. Literally. Now, of course, we take it for granted. China's rise has reshaped the entire world. A lot of people fear a new Cold War already. But before we jump to that conclusion, let's first understand all of Asia, past, present, and future. It is indeed the largest, most diverse, most populous region of the planet Earth. 5 billion people. Very often when you hear the word Asia, you just think China or Japan. And the first thing I want to do today is to make sure that you appreciate all of Asia. For anyone who has any background in geography, this is a very important point. We teach our children every day that Europe and Asia and Africa and South America and North America are different continents. But Europe and Asia are not on different continents. You share one continent called Eurasia. And the more globalization gets us connected, the more I think you will appreciate that Asia is not a far-off continent. It is truly an adjacent region with which you are getting more and more connected. Now, as I said, it is so central to the world in many ways, but first and foremost is, of course, demographics. There's a saying, demography is destiny. I'm sure you've all heard it. Now, we all know Asia has a lot of people. Here you can see that 51% of the world population lives just in that circle. And that's not even all of Asia. But what's different now, and as we move forward, is that, as you may know, the world population is no longer predicted to rise to 12 billion, 15 billion people, the way many people forecasted just 15 or 20 years ago. Instead, we actually think the world population may plateau at under 10 billion people. So in other words, we're already almost there. Most of the people who will ever live in the world, ever, are already alive today. That's how rapidly the world population is actually plateauing. And therefore, not only does Asia have the majority of the world population today, it always will. For your lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, our grandchildren's lifetimes. That's another reason why it's so significant to understand. It's not just a passing phase, not just a moment where America passes the baton to China, and then from China it goes to India, and India to somewhere else. No. It's different now because Asia is going to perpetually have more people, and more and more and more. So, the story, though, isn't just China, it isn't just India. It's a collective story that is extremely important for everyone to understand. Because the Asian economic miracle began immediately at the end of World War II with Japan. Japan was the country that first rose from the devastation of World War II, and within just 25 years, Japan had overtaken West Germany, which existed then, to be the world's second largest economy. And that story of modernization and industrialization is what inspired the tiger economies, right? The second wave of Asian growth. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Together, those first and second waves were the inspiration for the reforms that China undertook exactly 40 years ago. Here we are, 2019, it was 1979 that Deng Xiaoping in China opened up Shenzhen in southern China in the Pearl River Delta as China's first special economic zone. So China became the third wave of modern Asian growth. And to this day, the most loyal and significant investors in China are Japan and South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. So forget the lens that you are looking at the world economy with today, which is all about trade war, trade war, trade war. Everything is zero sum, right? We'll get to the trade war in a minute. But if you want to understand Asian economics, think of it as a mutually reinforcing set of waves. And this is just the first three waves. And for so many people in our Western societies, media, economists, and so forth, this is where it stops. It's all about China, China, China. You may have seen that video clip on YouTube where Donald Trump is saying China like 500 times from all these different speeches, and he's obsessed. And we are all a bit too obsessed with China because we're forgetting that the next wave has already begun. The fourth wave of modern economic growth. And this is the countries from Pakistan through India, through Southeast Asia. Now look at that number on the bottom, 2.5 billion people. We are trapped in this narrow conversation where when we talk about Asia, we're talking about just China, and we're forgetting 2.5 billion people. Oops, I just forgot them, right? But yes, they exist, right? 2.5 billion people, that's a lot more people than China. It's spread across this dozen countries, colored in orange here. And every single one of them has a population that is a median age that is younger than China's median age. Many of them are also growing faster now than China, even receiving more foreign investment than China. But remember that it is not zero sum. Who are the largest investors in these countries, after all? It is Japan, it is China, it is Singapore, right? And that's the collective economic story, these four waves of growth. And the fourth wave is just taking off. So even if you're pessimistic about China, even if you believe its growth rate is slowing, its debt level is so high, its population is aging, it's an environmental catastrophe, all of that might be true. It doesn't mean that the Asian story is over, right? Because for half of that Asian population, it's really just beginning. Now, if you take those four waves of Asian growth, if you take all those Asian economies together and you depict them by the size of their economies in purchasing power parity terms, right? PPP. How you measure the size of an economy based on what consumers in that economy pay in their own prices for goods and services. What you see, of course, is that Asia is already half the total world economy. It's half the world's population, it's half the world's economy. Of course, collectively, it's also growing a lot faster, so its share is going to grow even further. You also see that the largest bubble here is indeed China. A lot of people ask, when will China overtake the United States? When will it have the world's largest economy? Well, in PPP terms, it most certainly already does. And the poorer countries of Asia actually benefit the most from this upward revision and the switch to PPP measurement. For example, in India, there's a national strategy to have a $5 trillion economy in US dollar terms, but of course in PPP terms, it's already almost $9 trillion. So this is the story of Asian economies, their true, actual size today. And it is a system. A system means they are ever more integrated with each other. And that is the story of the last 30 years. Here we are again, 2019. It's the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, it was November 9th, so just in a couple of weeks from now, 30 years ago. Soviet Union collapsed a couple of years after that, 1991. For us in the West, what were the major memorable events or milestones of that period? We can think about the consolidation of Europe with the Maastricht Treaty and the introduction of the Eurozone, the tragic Balkan Wars, NATO expansion, 9/11 terrorist attacks, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Eventually you come around to Brexit and Trump, right? That's our last 30 years in one sentence, right? Not the happiest set of stories, unfortunately. That's why a lot of people in my field of geopolitics reflect on the West having squandered some of the opportunities of the Cold War victory. Not many of those episodes or instances that I just mentioned matter to the 5 billion people of Asia, right? Their last 30 years looks very, very different. Now, you can be excused for not having been paying attention to the Indian worldview or the Chinese worldview or the Indonesian worldview of the last 30 years. Every people, every country is focused on itself. So let me just remind you that for the past 30 years, walls have not been going up in Asia, borders have not been going up, protectionism has not been the dominant feature of life in Asia. Accompanying this breakneck economic growth has been an incredible amount of integration, of barriers coming down, borders coming down, migration rising between these countries. So here you can see the dyads, the connections of trade growth between any pair of countries in the Asian zone. And every single one of these arrows and every single number they reflect has risen over the last 20 years, 10 years, 5 years to today. Immense growth. Asia, if anything, is to some degree becoming self-sufficient. Because what you have on this map, for example, are colored in pink, the West Asian, Middle Eastern, Arab oil producers. They've begun to send way more oil to the east, across the Indian Ocean, than they do to the west. You have industrial centers, not least, of course, China, but also Korea and Southeast Asian countries. You have food producers, all the way from Southeast Asia to Russia. You have high-tech economies, Japan, South Korea, and so forth. And you have plenty of labor, obviously, with billions of people. So Asia has been Asianizing, right? Becoming more and more of a system. To some degree, you might even say it is starting to decouple from the rest of the world. And this raises a fundamental point. If you want to capture the Asian business opportunities of the 21st century, you have to go there. They're not going to come to you anymore. Although I did notice that my flight on Finnair from Singapore last night was full, which is great. You do have lots of people coming over here. But if you want to sell into those markets, you need to go there and be in Asia. These arrows, and you can do the same thing for the whole world, represent those corridors of trade and financial flows. So if you are pessimistic about globalization, like you might be if you are in Britain right now, for example, right? It's not because globalization is failing, right? It's not because globalization is reversing. It's because you have either cut yourself off from it or you are being bypassed by these growing patterns and connections. You have to go where the action is. Just to take one example, international flight routes. Asia is home to all 10 of the 10 busiest by volume of international pairs of airline routes. The most dense are between Hong Kong and Singapore, Singapore and Jakarta, Dubai and Mumbai, and various other combinations. And this is also reflective of the way in which Asia is becoming more self-reliant, because Asia has old people, yes, particularly in Japan and South Korea and China, but it also has billions of young people. And by not being as restrictive on migration, what they're starting to do is to fill those labor shortages. Japan, for example, which we tend to think of as being a very insular country culturally, has never had 2 million non-Japanese people living in Japan. And today it does. Hundreds of millions of, or more than 1 million Chinese, South Koreans, Vietnamese, Indians. It will never become a melting pot, right? It's not going to look like Berlin, but it's certainly a change in mentality. So Asians are starting to work together more and more. You can see it also, again, just to prove that you may see a large number or a growing number of Asian tourists or business travelers coming here. That figure has doubled. But the internal travel, and this also is mirrored in the trade data I showed you earlier, has tripled, right? So the rate of growth of internal activity is far, far higher. Now, let's talk about that trade war that's on everyone's mind, right? I get asked very often if I could spend 5 minutes with Donald Trump and try to give him some advice, what would I say? And I guess there's a very long list, but I'm told I only have 5 minutes. And we all know that he doesn't like to read thick books, like mine, I guess. So I figured just one image, if I could show him one map, and I suppose this is useful for anyone, it would be this one. What am I showing you here? So the 3 centers of the world economy, the same ones that you saw on the previous slide with the bubbles, are of course North America, Europe, and Asia. In terms of their role in global trade, what you see is that while America is still the largest economy in the world in US dollar terms, it is the least trade dependent. North America together represents only 14% of global trade. It has what you would call autarky, self-sufficiency in many ways, which is a wonderful thing geopolitically, right? But in terms of having leverage on global trade, it means that you are less influential than you think you are. This is one reason why I would show him this slide. Another is to look at Europe, 38% of global trade. To a large degree, of course, because of your internal trade with each other here in Europe. And Asia is catching up with 34% based on those arrows I was showing you before. But the most important number on this slide is the one on the upper right. It says $1.6 trillion. That is your current volume, Europe's current volume of trade in goods annually with Asian countries. A lot of it is China, but it's also Japan, it's also South Korea, Southeast Asia, India, and so forth. That Europe-Asian trade is the largest corridor of trade between regions in the world. Now, many of us grew up in a transatlantic era. I was born in India, but I grew up in the US and in Germany. So I'm a child of transatlantic relations. I went back and forth across the Atlantic for many, many years. So even for me, grew up in that NATO alliance, Euro-Atlantic system. We are the center of the world. The Western civilization shapes the world order. Right up through graduate school, that's what all of my papers and articles were about. A lot has changed in a very short amount of time. And one reason why I would show this slide to American officials is because they need to understand that even the European activities, even if our mentality is still transatlantic, your behavior as Europeans is much more Eurasian, right? You literally have a more intense economic relationship with Asia than you do across the Atlantic. Now, that number, 1.6 trillion, is going to grow and grow and grow. Normally, when 2 regions of the world are trading $1 trillion a year with each other, you would expect that they have a free trade agreement already, seamless infrastructure, no barriers or customs clearance, requirements and so forth. And yet, your trade with Asia is so much, even though almost none of those things are in place yet. That is the incredible potential opportunity. You don't have free trade with, you only have a free trade agreement now that's coming into effect with Japan. With ASEAN, Southeast Asia, not yet. With China, of course not. We're trying all the time to pry open the Chinese market. And as those things happen, and as the Belt and Road Initiative evolves and advances and creates more seamless connectivity, that trade is going to grow and grow and grow. So we are moving very much into a Eurasian system. Like I said at the beginning, you will see that it is not a far off region or continent over there. we very much share this space, and I expect that integration to continue. So what I referred to earlier as a potential Asian decoupling is more of, let's call it, a Eurasian decoupling. So why is Asia growing so quickly? Sometimes just having a lot of people isn't enough, right? And of course, getting more internally connected through trade, that's one factor. But what are all these people doing? Where are they going? Well, I mentioned that 40 years ago is when China established Shenzhen as a special economic zone. And that's right down there in the southern part of the map, right? It's the southern tip right near Hong Kong of the Greater Bay Area, as it's called. And that one urban cluster, that megacity cluster, has just overtaken Tokyo as the most populous urban cluster in the world. It has more than 60 plus million people. And it's not even forecast to be the largest one in China. Chongqing and Chengdu, which you see right in the middle, are coming together and being administratively governed increasingly as one unit. And that population is projected to be about 80 million people by the year 2030. So one administrative cluster of cities in the center of China will have more people than the largest country in Europe, Germany, right, whose population has been declining if it were not for immigration, right? So try to just step back and appreciate the scale. I won't even mention which Asian country Finland's population would most good. I'm not even sure there is an Asian country that small. Well, actually, yes, Singapore, where I live, has only about 6 million people, right? So again, orders of magnitude, right, difference. So it's the agglomeration of people into these urban clusters that matters. And this is something that China, as you well know, has taken a very strong lead in doing. Despite the diversity of Chinese civilization, the different provincial and linguistic histories, they are moving towards this administrative reorganization. And each of these clusters has anywhere from 5 to 10 cities. They're very well connected to each other in terms of infrastructure, highways and railways and so forth. Also to each other through high-speed rail, aircraft, aviation, and so forth. And so this is where Chinese investment has been going. It's also been going into Belt and Road. You might call it the new Silk Roads, as I mentioned before. Now, this is, again, something that didn't just begin 3 or 4 years ago when Xi Jinping gave a speech about the need for Asians to reconnect with each other. This has been happening since literally the day the Soviet Union collapsed. I started traveling in the 1990s through the Central Asian countries, the former Soviet republics. And already I saw Chinese infrastructure projects across Kazakhstan and so forth. Again, perfect complementarity. Oil demand, oil supply. Trade, increasing trade with Europe and with the Middle East, and a corridor and a pathway to get there and achieve it. So the lines that you see on this map, whether it is the pipelines or the railways, fiber optic internet cables, electricity grids, all of these have been in development for almost 30 years. Now, this is also important because you will read contrasting things in your media and newspapers. Some people will say China is using the Belt and Road as a hegemonic plot to dominate the world. Others will say it's just a collection of debt traps for smaller and weaker countries, and it's going to ignite a backlash and collapse. The truth is somewhere in between. I can tell you, as someone who, again, has been traveling these corridors for 25 years, that I see a lot of momentum behind this project. Why? Well, remember how many people live in this rectangle. This is not the full sphere of the Earth. This is just one rectangle. But you've got more than 5 billion people living here. Most of them are either in post-colonial countries, right, like India or Pakistan, or former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. They have not had high quality, have not had new infrastructure for decades, decades and decades. And their populations, unlike yours, have tripled, in some cases quadrupled in the last 70 years since the British Empire collapsed. So they need this. And if they're landlocked countries, then they need connectivity more than ever in order to be part of the global economy. And generally speaking, historically, whether it is China building your infrastructure or you building it yourself, it is catalytic for growth. And one of the very important things that's happening here on this map is that as these infrastructures get built, the young people will urbanize. They will move to cities, and you will see more of those oval-like urban clusters come together. So imagine dozens of cities with anywhere from 5 to 10 million people on this map that are not that far away. If you think about it, here we are just off to the northwestern corner there. This is the future growth markets. And there's still a lot of work to be done in these cities in terms of deploying technology, modernizing, skills training. All of these things are necessary. And so this story is far from complete. For China themselves, they think of it as a 100-year plan. But they're not the only ones who do. In fact, now even Europe, America, Japan are all saying, we want to contribute to this story. Just last Friday, I was in Brussels when Juncker and Prime Minister Abe signed an agreement about joint Euro-Japanese sustainable infrastructure finance to compete with China to provide affordable lending, concessional terms to help these countries invest and grow. This is just the beginning of the story. I call it competitive connectivity. The way you win in the 21st century is not simply by isolating yourself, not just by being big, not just by having a large economy or a lot of military power. It's about how connected are you with the rest of the world. And I think that Finland can do even more to use your geography, use your wealth, use your technology, use your connectivity to Asia to participate in this story. When I was logging into the Wi-Fi on my flight, Finnair gave me some fun facts. Finnair was the first airline to have nonstop flights to Tokyo, to Beijing. I hope that's true. I hope they weren't lying. I'm sure you were. So no doubt you have that foresight, you have that capability. Now let me remind you again that the story isn't just China. A few years ago, I moved to Singapore. It's just towards the bottom center of the map there. And this is the Southeast Asian region. Now here you have only 700 million people. Right? So in Europe, in other words, fits comfortably both geographically and demographically into the space on this map. About a dozen countries. And with half the population of India, this region has a larger GDP than India. With half the population of China, it now receives more foreign investment than China. There's a joke going on right now among economists. This is what passes for a joke in economics. It's the trade war is over. Vietnam won. Because you can see the enormous diversion of supply chains. The same forces of foreign investment and supply chain shifts that propelled China are now coming to the Southeast Asian region because their wages are lower, right? And their markets are also growing. So there's tremendous potential in this region. They have spent the last 20 years since the Asian financial crisis. I've gone through a few anniversaries with you just to remember. 40 years ago when Shenzhen became a special economic zone. 30 years ago when the Cold War ended. 20 years ago was the Asian financial crisis. 10 years ago is when Asian trade within Asia became greater than its trade with the rest of the world. You can see the evolution every decade towards this Asian system. Now, over the last 20 years, these countries have focused so much on fixing the crony capitalism that characterized their economies. They have higher currency reserves, trade surpluses, and now they can borrow, their governments can borrow long-term debt, their companies as well, in their own currencies. Global financial markets are willing to buy the bonds of Indonesia or other countries on a 20-year, 30-year basis. And that's why they're less dependent on the US dollar. They can do long-term planning. They can build those cities of the future, those futuristic cities that you see on television. And so let me go back to this urbanization. You can see here The world population, the entire world population actually is on this map. So every human being, every one of you, me, the world, we are a pixel actually on this map. So of course you see how Asian the world population is, with yellow and purple being the most, yellow and pink being the most dense geographies. So of course that's Asia again. What I've superimposed for you here are these ovals. Though that shows you those megacities again, not just the Chinese ones, but all of them in Asia. Now, this is your corporate strategy map. I eliminated the political boundaries. It matters less what country you're in than what cities you're in. So when you go to your next management meeting and you're saying, I heard this guy talk about Asia, let's think about our presence there. The question is, where are your offices? Are you represented in Manila, in Jakarta, in Mumbai, in Chengdu? Do you operate? Do you have partnerships, whatever the case may be, in these cities, in these ovals? There's 48 of them in total in the world. The majority of them are in Asia. You want to be there because it takes a very long time for a city to become a megacity. And these are the places where the urbanization, the infrastructure investment, the supply chain activity, the innovation is happening in these places. We could come back in 2030 and probably nothing would have changed so much on this map. So this is your way to think about Asia. Now, in these cities, of course, the quality of life is not exactly all the same, right? We know that of the 5 billion people in Asia, at least 2 billion are still poor, quite poor. They would find themselves on the left-hand side of this slide in terms of the rudimentary level of their infrastructure in cities, inadequate sanitation, housing, healthcare, and so forth. Very long way to go. They're climbing up to the basic level. Very few places are at the advanced level or this kind of smart city level. Helsinki we would put, of course, here on the far right. There are not many Helsinkis in Asia. But I know that Asian cities wish they were like Helsinki, that's for sure. How are they going to get there? Not necessarily by themselves, right? If you go there, you do business there, you're going to help them, right? And they're going to help you grow as well. And that's the ambition that you see amongst Asian mayors, governors, provincial leaders, heads of state. It's all about infrastructure investment in cities. Asia actually has, I should just remind everyone, more democracies than non-democracies. This is another one of the fallacies that we have when we look at Asia and all we see is China. Let me remind you that there are more people living in democracies in Asia than the rest of the planet put together, right? Just India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, just those three, all three of them had elections over the last year. That alone is 1.8 billion people, to say nothing of Japan and Korea and the other democracies. Now, they are not exactly the highest standard of democracy like a Finland, but they are democratic societies. And so in their election campaigns over the last year, you can see that they have a very common theme. In the Philippines, for example, it's build, build, build. That was actually the campaign slogan. And if your campaign slogan is build, 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 you can be like President Duterte of the Philippines. Now, we think of him as something of a thuggish figure, to put it mildly. But I bet every Finnish politician would be envious of his standing in the public opinion polls. He's today the most popular leader on earth. Right? Something like an 85 or 90% public approval rating. That's pretty good. Now, you have to understand where they're coming from. Most of the people live in conditions that are somewhere on the left side of this chart here, right? So they don't have the luxury of saying, you're just a thuggish, illiberal guy. They're saying, who's going to build for me? Who has a vision? Who's going to modernize this country, right? Who's going to uplift us? And I think that if you spent 5 minutes in Manila, you'd probably be a supporter of him too. And so it's not just the Philippines, like I said, Indonesia as well, India. One of the things that got Modi elected was not, and re-elected, is not only the huge infrastructure spending in the country, but the desire to upgrade cities, right? Turn all of India's major cities, especially those with the largest populations, into smarter cities, to um, upgrade their economies, obviously, to diversify them, to build skills of workers, just to do the basics also on housing, sanitation, internet, to liberalize the market for foreign investment. All of this means that even though India has plenty of ups and downs cyclically, right now it's certainly having a bit of a down. But the potential is enormous, and the focus on reforms that has been lacking for such a long time is in fact now there. Now, here in Western countries, we're accustomed to being driven really by the services sector, right? We've gone through centuries past the phases of being agriculturally dependent and dependent on manufacturing. And Asia is actually going through a similar process. It does need all of that new infrastructure, which I've been talking about. But let's talk about the fact that the same economic sectors that drive a country like Finland or any European country are also very strongly at play. We cannot evaluate economies, even poor developing countries, by the same standards or metrics or methodologies that we did decades ago. I gave you the example earlier of measuring economies in US dollars versus purchasing power parity. The other mistake we make is to think that all poor countries must go through a very long phase of depending on manufacturing, the manufacturing industry, and export-led growth to rich countries like here, and then one day they will reach a middle income level, and then they will struggle to cross a middle income trap, and then after another 10 or 20 years, they may one day have a stronger services sector, and after 50 years, they can become like us. That is literally the conventional economic paradigm that we apply very often when we look at developing markets. But it's wrong. That's what I'm showing you here. What you see is that more than 50% of the economies of most Asian countries, except for the commodities exporters, obviously, is already services. Even if they're poor countries, they are already more like us than we think, because their economies are driven by urbanization, financialization, digitization. We used to think that people wouldn't want insurance for a home or loans to buy a car or to want to invest in retirement or any of these things unless they had at least $10,000 a year per capita income in US dollar terms. But today, if you go to a Myanmar, Indonesia, or Vietnam, countries that are way poorer than that, that's what's happening. They are digitized, they're financialized, and of course, they're urbanized. So if you think about these processes, you get a better understanding of what the new economic model is that we already live in here, but they do too, even if they're poorer. And so in a way, think of the people of the world as actually being much more similar than we think, whether we're separated by culture, separated by geography, political system. The truth is, we have a lot in common in terms of our ambitions and where are we on this curve towards services economies. You can see it, obviously, again, the digitization, right? The billions of people that are already online in Asia, you know very well that 5G is a force now coming out of China and also Japan. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But all of the opportunities, especially for a country that is innovative in IT and software, such as Finland, think about the need to spread these key technologies and platforms, whether it is the enterprise software, the e-commerce apps, the gaming industry, and so forth, right? Think about imagine those bubbles getting larger and larger, billions of people online, including the final 2 billion. Surely they're all going to be playing Angry Birds, right? At one point or the other, or whatever you brilliant Finnish game designers come up with after Angry Birds. They'll be playing that. So a big opportunity. Now, why is there's one difference though, one critical difference besides income when it comes to the fact that Asian economic structure is similar to ours. Here, we tend to think that technology and jobs are an either-or kind of situation, right? We live in daily fear that the robots are coming for our jobs. What's happening in Asia, though, is because they're starting from such a low base, right? The fact is that it's a both and story for quite some time to come. So e-commerce has arrived across Asia. You can have drone delivery now in a number of countries, from New Zealand, even in parts of India. They're starting to do that. And of course, everyone is online. But retail is growing. Google, if you want, what are the 20 cities with the largest number of new shopping malls being built? You know, hint, it's not, Helsinki is not on the list, right? They're all in Asia. So both and. We think AI is killing jobs. Well, you have such a high demand for software programmers and for upgrading the architecture of firms in Asia that, generally speaking, the IT industry is creating far more jobs across Asia than it's destroying. So it's a both and story. So the technology ecosystems are very robust in Asia. This is the startup investment by country. You can see, again, China's circle is almost as large or larger than the American circle. Some countries like China, Japan, South Korea, and India have a full stack, right, technologically. They have that indigenous capability, but that's still a story into which you can invest and sell services. Then look at the rise of the indigenous companies themselves, some still private, others listed. Alibaba and Tencent of China have taken the lead in their investments into Southeast Asian companies, but you also have the rise of national champions, private companies that have benefited from the software programming, design, and other technology services that have come, not just from China, but from Western companies, for example, Amazon and so forth. So you can see a list here of some of the main, top, fastest growing technology companies in some of the key Asian markets. So a lot of us fear that there's going to be this splinter net, right? China and Huawei and its 5G are carving up the world into two camps. I don't believe that's actually what's going to happen, and Southeast Asia is a good example of why. Countries are happy to take Chinese funding, if you will, but they're also opening up their markets and requiring that there be competition to provide those critical services. And Japan is a very good example of this, of course, because it is the fear, if you will, of this bifurcated world, of this technology arms race that has inspired many of these countries to encourage Finland and Sweden and the United States and others to get into the 5G race. So as you well know, Nokia is going to be working with Japanese companies on their 5G infrastructure as well. So let me start to wrap things up. When you think about Asia, you should be thinking about this huge population, its geographic diversity being much more than just China, and especially looking at the urbanized populations, especially the young. And don't think of it as an underdeveloped region. Think of it as one that wants to have the latest and the best. The things that you have achieved, that you have innovated, that you can sell into them. And it applies to all aspects of life in cities, whether it's the things that help them overcome the pollution, that nasty byproduct of modernization that is affecting all of Asia, or whether it is the driverless cars, which we're starting to have in places like Singapore and Japan and China, the industrial robotics. Think about the ways in which your software platforms can be used to upgrade people's skills. There's still such an education gap as well in Asia. And of course, the lifestyle component of it, the things that we take for granted, telemedicine, digital healthcare, our seamless communications with each other, and all of the ways in which we use that. Asians aren't going to wait to have those things. In fact, if you don't go and do the business and selling it to them, they'll just get it and leapfrog you. So those are my points, just to conclude that Asia is really bigger than China. There is this fourth wave, and you should focus on that as well. It may seem crude to use this phrase, poverty is an opportunity, but here in Europe, in the West, we are so despondent about the economic inequality issue. We treat inequality as this a lightning rod in our politics, and it is. But Asia has suffered from so many generations of extreme poverty that even though it is way more unequal than Europe, right, the income gap between Asian countries is not 2 to 1, right? It's not the gap between, say, Finland and Moldova. It's the gap between, say, Singapore and Myanmar. That's a gap of 50 to 1, 50 to 1. So Asia has way more inequality than you would ever have in the West, and yet they don't talk about inequality that much. They say, we still have billions of poor people, we have to do something about it. It's a proactive approach. I think it's a positive approach, and it's also a business opportunity. And remember, they will leapfrog, but don't be afraid. And this is my final point. I started at the beginning with that joke about the Soviet Union feeling that it was going to be overrun by China, right? But in fact, in a way, what Asia is doing really is just catching up. Catching up, it's taking its rightful place alongside the West. Neither China nor Asia is going to replace Western civilization, the innovations, the forms of government, the standards, the quality of life, the pride that we should have, whether you're North American or European, in what we've achieved. So don't view the rise of Asia as a threat. Most of all, view it as the dawn of a new era. We've never lived in a truly multi-civilizational, multipolar world. It's an extremely exciting time, and it can be a time that's peaceful, prosperous. Certainly, it's one where it's an opportunity if you take advantage of it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got time for a question or two. So if you've got a catch box to flag down, we've got some catch box wannabe users here up front. I'd love to come. They're so politely raising their hand. There's one right up front, waving back and forth like a railroad crossing.
Hello. Hi, my name is Reetta. I come from a company called KEA. I find your presentation extremely interesting, not only due to the fact that we got our first deal in Singapore just last week. Mm-hmm. So my questions, I have in fact two, might be kind of minor things, but I'm interested in your view on the developments in Hong Kong. So how do you comment on that? What kind of a impact could that have? And then I'm very much of a fan of Australia. So does that have any role to play in what you presented?
Great questions. I mean, I think it is obviously it's a tragic situation that's unfolding in Hong Kong. But for those of us who have been observing the region, traveling there, and researching it, it's a 22-year-old story now, because China had negotiated at the time of the handover in 1997 that a substantial number of mainland Chinese families could legally move and reside in Hong Kong every single year. And that number today is well over 1 million. So one cannot speak of a coherent Hong Kong population with a strong sense of an independent identity that applies to all people of Hong Kong. It's not true, for better or worse. It's a clash of generations, a clash of nationalities now in the country. I was there in 2014 at the Umbrella Revolution that inspired a lot of the current protesters, and I definitely sympathize with the fact that they had certain expectations for maintaining political autonomy that were made 5 years ago, and that was not honored. So you can certainly understand why the protests have become so violent, because they do view it as their last chance. However, the legal, if you will, privileges still do largely lie with China, in the sense that it is a Chinese territory now. It has been that way for 22 years. There are aspects of the basic law that are clearly being eroded, faster than we would like them to be. And that's a process they're going to have to keep on negotiating. But if you want, a blunt answer, which I'm sure you do, the truth is that it doesn't really end well for Hong Kong as we knew it. It's going to have a new and more humble role within China. Obviously, it still will have very special characteristics as a portal to the rest of the world, and its sort of cultural attributes and flair. But it's not going to be the lens through which we view China anymore and invest in China the way it used to be. And your question about Australia, yes. So it's so funny, that map of the megacities of the world, Australia is just falling off the bottom. And if I ever show that in Australia, the hands go up, they say, what about us? What about us Australians? We're not on your map. And I say, sorry, it's just a glitch of space. And also, you could fit the entire population of Australia in Jakarta. right? So Australia doesn't have megacities, but Australia has some of the most livable cities in the world, just like Northern Europe. Australia is learning that it also needs to, invest in and trade more with countries beyond China. It's really been hitched to China because of its iron ore exports, and they have to, see themselves as a partner of Asia, the analogy I make is that Australia has looked at Asia the way the UK has looked at Europe. We're sort of better than you, we're detached from you, and actually they don't care about you is what's actually been happening, right? It's that, Europe is saying bye-bye UK, and Asians are saying, Australians, either you come and, you offer us something, or you'll just sail off into Antarctica, and so I think Australians they're actually having an awakening, and it's generational again. Older Australians have a certain attitude, but younger Australians view themselves as part of Asia. For them, it's completely intuitive. And their demographics have shifted so much in the last 20 years that, as you may know, the largest number of new migrants and new citizens and so forth in Australia are Asians.
That was a doozy. So we've got, very quickly, I want to have you tackle this question. We don't have, in fact, we're not going to. We don't have enough time for more questions, I'm afraid. So if you're thinking of a question.
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm glad we didn't have time for that.
It's a doozy, right? It's a doozy, right? It's a good one.
Offline.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but your spunk and vigor is appreciated this time. Give it up for the Dr. Jones of trade, Parag Khanna.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.